Thank you, Madam Pro Tem. Uh, We had a Recreation Advisory Commission meeting on Tuesday, February 25th, and several items were discussed. We're going to go over this first one, urban archery program. The second one, we're going to kind of make that short and sweet, as well as the third and fourth. So we're going to spend a little bit more time with this first one because it's an actionable item. Okay, so Mr. Kyle McNamara is here, and I'm going to ask him to be available when I finish this presentation for further questions. He gave a wonderful presentation. Some of you were there. He's also provided you with, I think maybe are those copies of the PowerPoint slides. This gentleman did an excellent job of presenting this issue to us, and we really do appreciate him coming out, as well as Dr. Bill Jarman was there to support the issue also. So we can let these folks speak if you all have questions directly to them. But I'm going to take a minute and just read this, only because I feel like the audience here, as well as to let it stand for the public, that they get a good idea of what's going on, because I feel like this is something that's going to require public input, and the more education the public has. So bear with me, only because some of you have heard this before. So Mr. Kyle McNamara, a local citizen and hunter, made a presentation on managing the rapidly increasing deer populations in Gastonia through the implementation of the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission's Urban Archery Program. The NC Wildlife Resource Commission is NCWRC, began offering the additional archery-only deer hunting season with the intention of enabling cities and towns with the opportunity to effectively and safely reduce the deer populations through increased hunter opportunity. In 2014, 44 cities and towns in North Carolina participated and included Belmont, Chapel Hill, China Grove, Concord, Huntersville, Kannapolis, Wake Forest, and Weddington, to name a few. Durham just approved an ordinance amendment and will participate in 2015. Overpopulation of deer is a problem in many other states as well, and has prompted similar programs in Atlanta, San Jose, Indianapolis, Richmond, Dallas, Cincinnati, and Kansas City. So Mr. McNamara provided statistical information showing the nation's deer population to have risen from a few 100,000 in the early 1900s to over 32 million today. And the current deer population in North Carolina is conservatively estimated at 1.1 million and continuing to grow rapidly. His research showed that wildlife biologists estimate that acceptable density levels are 20 to 30 deer per square mile, and already in 2010, Gaston County density levels had grown to as much as 44 deer per square miles. That number will continue to grow, has been the case with neighboring Mecklenburg County. Mr. McNamara also provided information and statistics on the effects of overpopulation of deer in the city in the 4-year period 2009 to 2012. There have been 20 deer-related car accidents, car accident fatalities, and 3,500 that resulted in personal injury. And there were 20,181 reported deer-related car accidents, which represented a 35% jump from 20,004. In that same 3-year period, the NCDOT estimates damages related to deer-related car accidents to be $144 million. In 2009, the Gastonia Police Department reported that officers were called to deer car collision sites within the city limits 16 times, 45 in 2012 and 33 in 2013, showing a definite rise just in the last 4 years. Crop damages are estimated to be $30 million per year. Dr. Bill Jarman gave personal testimony to deer overpopulation, contributing to damages in excess of 60% of his sunflower and soybean crop. He worked with NCWRC to manage and thin the herds in his area, and he has seen a dramatic comeback in his crop yields, and also noted he has seen no deer car-related accidents on the road that goes through his property. And he normally say many before the management program. Normally saw many before the management program. Deer also cause damage to many homeowner vegetable gardens, as well as ornamental plants, fruit-bearing trees, and grasses. There's a strong correlation between growth in deer populations and growth in certain dangerous diseases such as Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Deer act as a host for ticks, which carry these common diseases in North Carolina. The Center for Disease Control had confirmed a 69% Lyme disease growth rate in North Carolina between 2008 and 2012, and in 2012, the CDC reported 598 cases of Rocky Mountain spotted fever in North Carolina, including the first death in 2009. Overpopulation has caused starvation for some herds, making them more susceptible to other diseases and causes them to move to search for food, increasing the numbers, crossing highways and roads, thereby increasing the chances of deer car-related accidents. Other management methods are fencing off areas, repellents, relocation, hiring sharpshooters, and anti-fertility vaccinations. These methods are cost prohibitive, ineffective, and some are experimental. Urban archery is the most effective and proven management practice and produces positive impacts at no cost to the taxpayer. It's proven that urban archery is safe, that the NCWRC reports 0 accidents since the program's inception to bystanders or to pets. All hunters in North Carolina must be licensed through the NCWRC and go through a training and certification course. The NCWRC would take on the responsibility of enforcing all the existing NC hunting regulations as well as any specific restrictions required by city ordinance. Mr. McNamara proposed hunters starting a program where the meat could be processed and provided to local food pantries to feed the needy. Mr. McNamara requested and is petitioning along with other members of the community, and there's a petition website as you see listed here, and they're petitioning the RAC and City Council to consider changing the city ordinance to allow urban archery in the city limits of Gastonia through the NCWRC urban archery program to include the regular hunting season, which goes from September 8th to January 1st, as this allows for the taking of does before the breeding season, and the extended season from January 15th through February 19th. To participate in the 2015 hunting season, a letter of intent application along with a map of proposed hunting areas must be submitted to the NCWRC by April 1st. And the staff's recommendation respectfully requests that the following restrictions be included in the amended ordinance should council decide in favor of the urban archery program. That number 1, no hunting be allowed in city parks, and number 2, it is unlawful to discharge a bow within 100 yards of any city park, school, daycare, or church. And the committee's recommendation was a unanimous vote, 7-0, to take the archery program proposal to City Council for their approval. And Mr. McNamara is to make contact with the NCWRC member and get a definitive date on when an ordinance has to be in place, and also provide some sample ordinances. And Chuck Dellinger is to make contact with the state office, which he did, and secure any necessary paperwork involved in the application and official timelines. So the council is requested to discuss this issue and move forward or not. The things that come to mind with this is public input, is important, and I think the purpose of this discussion at this point is to see if council is interested in looking at this as a new ordinance for the city, and if so, then we would go through a proposal to have a draft ordinance created and then a public hearing for this purpose. Now, if there's a fairly strong interest on the part of council, then an application could be, submitted by the April 1st deadline for the NCWRC with the strong assurance that would move forward. We wouldn't want to make that application and then pull back from that, because once that application is approved, then we're going to get into their calendar and all, and that just wouldn't work with them. So I open it up for discussion.
Councilman McIntyre.
Let me say that I'm not a hunter, don't want to be. I was a fisherman. But when you have the bow and arrow and you shoot a deer and you hit him in the hips or her, it injures the deer and it brings a lot of pain to them, whereas a high-powered rifle, you'd end it just like that.
Let's bring Mr. McNamara up, and we can ask him some specific questions, because I think that's an excellent question. And I think he's got a great answer for you.
Yeah, well, I think that first, these deer are starving, it's our fault for building all these homes and industries out in their territory. I wish I'd been a multi-billionaire, I could've bought all this land and put it in the conservancy. But I'm not, and I can't, so it really worries me about a deer. I'm very sympathetic to them. I realize they're overpopulated, and it creates a real problem. A friend of mine mashed in the front of their car by hitting a deer on Osceola, of all places. And luckily, they weren't injured, but the car was almost totaled. But it really bothers me that bow and arrow, and I'm sure you guys are skilled archers, but you would hit one that could run off into the woods, and you might not find it for a while, and it suffered a lot. And I'm real sensitive to that. But if you had a high-powered rifle, you could shoot the deer and kill him instantly. And so I wouldn't vote to support using bows and arrows to kill deer in our city. I don't like it anywhere, but that's just let you know how I feel about it right up front. Discharging a rifle's fine with me, but not bows and arrows.
Maybe Mr. McNamara could speak to, some of the, pros of bow hunting versus rifle and some of the safety issues too with that.
And Mr. McNamara, if you would give your name and your address for the record, I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Kyle McNamara, and I live at 309 Ogden Drive in Gastonia, North Carolina. So I'm sympathetic as well. I mentioned last time my mom is...
Kyle, speaking to the microphone.
I'm sympathetic as well. I'm kind of tall for this thing. My mom, I mentioned last time, is actually a board member of the Humane Society, so that's very much been a part of kind of my life. At the same time, I'm not a hunter just say for the sport aspect of it, but to be connected to, where's my food actually coming from? It's a different perspective in hunting, and I think it's a perspective that is growing rapidly. So to the bow hunting aspect of things, first of all, in city limits, I think the reason that the wildlife agencies across the country really have kind of gone for the archery aspect of things is because it's safer, right? You're talking about shooting 7 to 15 yards is the average take, right? So you're not shooting 100 yards away. So you've got that aspect of it's a lot safer. We're talking about from an elevated stand, right? So there's the safety aspect from the city's perspective. I would say there's maybe an image of archery hunting from the movies and whatnot of people just running around, shooting arrows off and wounding animals. But in fact, what you'll find with the statistics around archery hunting is these hunters are practicing way more than your average hunter who can just grab a gun, load it up, and fire after they get their license, right? So there's I would say maybe just suggesting that there's a little bit of a different mentality than people think about. And I'm into this for a couple of years now. It's not like I've been hunting archery my whole life, and I've just seen a different mentality there. It's a respectful mentality. It's not a mentality of let me just kind of fire off an arrow and see what happens. We know that there's exceptions, right? There's always going to be people who do the wrong thing, and then there's going to be people who do the right thing. But I'd say by and large, I've seen people doing the right thing in this community. There's actually evidence to show that when fired accurately, a bow is actually going to have a more humane kill than a gun because of the way that it actually does it, right? You're actually, when you without getting into too many of the gory details, the gun actually kills by shock, okay? So it's a different mechanism than with an arrow. So that's maybe a notion that people aren't used to either. And then I guess the last thing is part of the ethics of hunting, whether you're hunting with a bow or whether you're hunting with a gun, is that you are responsible for following up with that animal, right? I mean, the whole point is that you're hunting for food, right? Whether you could go to the supermarket or not and get antibiotic, filled animals versus going to get your own food. There's an ethic of pursuing that animal and making sure that you do right by what you just accomplished there, okay? I would say also, and I'm trying to address the number of the points that you raised, which are good points. While we have created some issues with overdevelopment, there's no question, that actually is independent of the herd growth. So the herd growth is a direct result of the most successful preservation effort in the history of the world, where we were almost extinct in many states, and now it's up to 32 million, more than there ever were before. So what ends up happening in the cities is you have these little islands where there's no hunting pressure, so from outside, the deer start coming in greater and greater numbers. They're growing, doubling in population every 2 to 3 years in many cases. So you've got kind of a dynamic that's not good all around. You've got populations doubling, you've got city centers, within city limits where they're congregating. Your accidents are going through the roof. People are dying. Actually, in the slides that I showed last time, we talked about the fellow that just died up here on Cherryville Highway. Was it in November? I mean, it's real. People are dying. And then, and this is kind of I think the most important point, by not doing something, simply by opting to say, we don't want to do anything because, we like deer, which is a fair perspective, and I respect that. You're not actually serving that animal, because ultimately they're going to die a lot more painfully by hitting a car, getting tossed across the road, hitting another car. I won't spare you the gory details, but that's what happened up there on the highway. It was a 2-car accident. The starvation that happens, which impacts the overall herd, the accidents that happen, and the suffering that happens from those accidents is, in my mind, a lot worse than selectively culling a herd through a managed program, even with a bow. And so that is kind of the overall, I think, perspective that I'm hoping to bring, that it's not willy-nilly, it's very safe for within the city. It's actually serving the overall herd, while at the same time providing people the opportunity to feed themselves in a very regulated way through the state. So that's kind of...
Question. Councilman Kimball.
Sir, question regarding, number one, to Councilman McAteer's varied questions. Off the top of your head, what would be the speed velocity of a bullet, like feet per second, versus a bullet versus an arrow? Do you have any idea on that?
It's 200 feet per second for, say, an average bullet, right? Whereas with a bow, it's a lot less, right? Which means your range is a lot less too.
Okay. Secondly, do you anticipate you would be governed? This is one of the questions that I had from some constituents. You would be sort of governed by the same hunting regulations with regard to occupied areas, neighborhoods. What's your thought on that?
So after looking at what the other 44 cities have done, my thought is a reasonable level of acreage would be 2 acres. And the way they define it at state is 2 acres contiguous. So you could have multiple tracts that combine to make 2 acres. But then there's a buffer from which you can't hunt within, a dwelling. Okay, so that is part of the ordinance that, generally is set forth. Now, I will say, Huntersville chose a different path. They said, we are just going to simply adopt that which NC Wildlife already has in place and not worry about making a complicated ordinance. Not that it's that complicated, but the point being, they just said, we're going to do that. And then those same things that apply. I mean, there's things in the NC Wildlife laws that you can't, you have to abide by anyway in terms of how close you can hunt to a building and those sorts of things. So I guess, to answer your question, 2 acres with the restrictions around, being at a safe distance from buildings is kind of what it boils down to, in an elevated stand as well.
Well, I guess where I was going, is there model legislation that you have, or are you, where do you fall with that, or you're falling back on the state regs?
So there's 2 options. Huntersville option, falling back on state regs completely.
Okay.
In which case there really is no limit on the size acreage or anything like that, but all the laws apply, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the easiest, but I respect the fact that, most of the 44 cities did some level of saying, well, within city limits, we want an elevated stand. I think that's reasonable. I think what you'll find is Hunterville is not going to have any more accidents than anybody else, but I understand the desire to have some set of rules around it as well.
Okay.
So I would say I have put forward some at the back of the books there. I kind of culled from all of the different cities what I thought was kind of the best approach. And
Okay.
I listed it out in the back of that as my proposal, you know, knowing that there's going to be some debate and some decisions around maybe modifying that, but that's a starting point.
Thank you for your input.
Councilman Gallagher.
Kyle, when someone shoots a deer, is that recorded? Was that reported to the state?
It is.
So,
In North Carolina, it is.
so when you say urban archery, when I first heard of this, I was thinking someone's gonna be down here on Main Avenue shooting from a balcony at some deer.
No.
But in actuality, it is within like a 2-acre area. The city's asking for 100 yards from houses, from parks, from
Basically any structure.
schools and churches
Yeah.
and daycare centers, which is reasonable. Plus, you have to have written permission
From the
to be,
landowner.
from the landowner to be on that property, to be able to shoot. When I first heard this, I was a little skeptical. We talked on the phone and stuff. Then I was driving home, and I live behind the library. And I was going down Churchill, and I went across the street as I was riding home, and here comes a 6-point buck jumping across the road. And I mean, I'm in the subdivision. I was like, that is just too much. The point I was making with the recording, the nice aspect of that is we could actually, if we enacted this and we had it within the city in 2 acres and above, we would be able to monitor which deer hunters are actually killing deer. And we could coordinate with the police department to find out where the most accidents are occurring within the town. And after a year's time, we would know who were the better hunters, and we could say, hey, listen, guys, we would like you to hunt over here.
There's certainly, we talked about this last time, a phase 2 where there's, some number of thousands of acres of publicly owned land. There's an opportunity to do that on a more regulated basis, I guess, is the.
Councilman Pearsall.
This may be more of a question for legal. If we vote to accept the committee's recommendation, that doesn't mean we're actually voting to approve an actual amendment tonight. Staff would put together a formal
Have to
ordinance.
Draft an ordinance.
Yeah, and
That's
this
right.
just kind of gives permission to do the application, that we're interested in it and we want to pursue and go ahead, correct?
My thought would be, and I'm not sure what staff's abilities are, but, if as far as timing goes with, certain circumstances as they be, but I think the idea would be to draft that ordinance, have a public hearing to accept public input, but if we have some interest, we should start that process. If we don't have any interest, let's let it die, right now. But if there's interest, we should move forward. But all we're doing is expressing interest in getting staff to, do their due diligence, just like we did with the drop boxes.
Right, and I just want to make the comment that I appreciate the advisory commission for letting us know in advance about this presentation that Mr. McNamara did. I was present for that. Very interesting, lot of information. You really need to see the whole presentation. And very interesting, learned a lot from it, and I think I'm Mr. Gallagher in that when I first heard urban archery, I was like, yeah, I don't need that here. But then after hearing what it actually means, it's not quite what you first envisioned. But having said that, I'd be willing to make the motion that we accept the committee's recommendation.
I will second.
I have a question, one question.
Well, there's discussion, and Mr. Dellinger would like to take
Yeah.
the podium also for a minute, so while we can do that during discussion.
Just one question, and it might have been covered. Is there a different permit regulations for urban archery as there is for just hunting license?
So, no.
No.
There's hunting education that is required of everybody.
And so urban archery is
archery-
all under that same umbrella?
It is.
That's
Urban
fine.
archery,
Fine.
the concept is essentially an add-on to the hunting season in terms of a special program for I guess it's something under a little over a month. But then as a concept is extended across the hunting season because of the problem that's actually there. So the idea being hunting season plus special urban archery season equals ability to control the deer population effectively.
Councilman Gallagher?
I would like to. Todd, I would like to add to that motion to say that we have the item drafted for our next meeting, March 18th, because April 1st would be I don't know why they're having it April 1st. Isn't that
April Fools.
thank you.
It is.
But April 1st is their deadline, so I'd like to see if we can have that drafted for the March 18th meeting, so we can vote on it at that time. Is that a problem?
Would we also have the public hearing at that time?
Well, and that's, I think, what I would like to address. Now, unless there is some part of the urban archery law that, from the North Carolina Wildlife Commission, this would not necessarily require a public hearing statutorily. So that would, certainly, council can at any time request a public hearing or advertise a public hearing, however you would decide to do it, but it would not necessarily require the public hearing. So, and from the timing standpoint, we could certainly bring something back at the next council meeting, whether, depending on how you would decide to have a public hearing, there might be some issues. You would have to decide how you would want to advertise it, or what type of advertising you would want to get out if you determine to have one, and that might cause, that might be the issue. Could you, would there be enough time to let people know that you were having the public hearing?
Well, if it's not required, could they not just come and speak on a
If they
public
want.
expression to the item that night?
Exactly.
Let Mr. Dellinger
Okay.
take the podium for a second, because I think, he can explain some things with regard to this April 1 date and what that actually is meaning, and maybe how we can coordinate this to get the answers we want.
Yes, sir. To hopefully clear up just a couple of things on dates and what probably can happen or needs to happen, is that April 1 date is a date that you have a letter of intent and a map. And what I passed around was several cities and towns have, some, like Huntersville, has no map, has no boundaries. Some have one all the way up to 5-acre tracts. Mostly it's 2 and 3. Kim Wallace in her planning actually came up with that map and actually was able to designate parks and schools, and I think she even has daycares and some of the churches listed on there. That map also has to be in their hands on April 1 as well. I talked to Dr. Cobb, who's the Division Chief of Wildlife Management, to get an interpretation. I had actually gotten an interpretation from someone locally, and it was not the correct interpretation that we were talking about in our RAC meeting last week, which was, we can file those papers for intent, and then basically decide whether we really want to or not, have till July 1 to get an ordinance together and then make that decision. That is, in fact, not the case. Dr. Cobb, and his words were to me that if you're not sure on April 1st, then wait till the next year. I'm not sitting here being an advocate for this year or next year or any year. With talking with Kyle early on and looking at the program, I really think it can be an outstanding program should this council decide to do that. Being a parks director, I just want to make sure we're not shooting bows and arrows in our park system. That's definitely on our agenda, and also to hopefully take care of schools and daycares and those other things. So that's where I am. I guess finding a committee to hear something like this, and I think because of our relationship with the Wildlife Resource Commission is probably the natural area, and we would be working with them as probably the committee to hear it from that aspect of it. So the April 1st would be, if we're going to make that, in my opinion, after talking with Dr. Cobb, who is the division chief in Raleigh, we want to make that intent to go forward for the 2014-2015, beginning September season, this April 1st deadline with the map to go along with it. The ordinance does not have to be done by then. It's just whether this body wants to have as much public input as needs to be. North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission is not going to require the public input. There is one other clarification that is different than when we met and when I helped construct the report, is that Wildlife Resource Commission they have jurisdiction over the hunting laws and regulations, but anything that we would put in extra, they would not. It's not that they would not have jurisdiction over it; they would actually not enforce it. If they saw it, or someone from a housing development or something saw someone do that, and they were called to an area to see it, they would hold the individual, and our city police department would actually be the ones who would make that citation or make that arrest. There's several different things, different options that you really need to consider in an ordinance. Some places charge. You have to sign up. You have to sign up to be able to do this. You have to fill out an application. Some folks do it for free. Some folks charge up to $10. I saw that. If you want to keep up with who's doing it, that's probably the one way to really take care of it. That 2-acre rule is definitely one that's there. There's another issue that's crossbow. Are you going to allow that? Again, these are issues that have come up after we've talked about it. Some cities do, some cities don't. The foot per second of the crossbow is about 10 times faster than what it is with a pulled bow, which makes it a little bit more lethal inside the city limits. There was a couple of others. China Grove actually has a very good ordinance. The town of Wake Forest has a very good ordinance. It's similar. It's very, very, very. I don't want to say simple, but everything is pointed. Everything is pointed. Some of them have. If you're going to have those ordinances in there, what are you going to do? You're going to find somebody, or you're going to charge somebody? What are you going to do if they don't abide by those? So to come up with some draft ordinances, whether it's through the legal and whether it's through us or whether it's through something that through Kyle's research, is all three of those. We need some guidance from council on which way to go with that concern. Not I think to draw something up ourselves and then come back to you at a later date or the next council meeting, but maybe some guidelines with where you wanted to go with that tonight, I think would probably help legal and definitely me and getting something from Kyle as well.
Councilman McIntyre.
I don't think we should be in a big rush. I think we ought to give a lot of thought to this in constructing an ordinance, especially the crossbow, full bow consideration. Don't be in such a mad rush to get it done. If you go create an ordinance, create a good one, bring it back for discussion, and I think you should have some type of public hearing. Or you don't have to declare a public hearing, just advertise it, so if you'd like to come discuss this at a meeting, or at your next committee meeting, you can do that, but I don't know, this kind of puts a hurt on legal to push them. They got a lot of things they're doing now. So I think we ought to give them a little more time to come up with something with Chuck and Mr. McNamara and legal, and anybody else you want to get involved with, look at all these other ordinances and put those together and see what might be in the best interest of the city of Gastonia. But I don't see why we got to rush for April 1st.
Well, my motion is just for the letter of intent, right? Not have an ordinance done by April 1st.
It's not to have an ordinance done, but if you're gonna, it's not.
If we're gonna do this,
It's to vote yes to
March,
do it.
April 1st is it.
and create the ordinance. It's not to send a letter of intent and then, well, maybe we're not gonna do this.
No, and I agree with that, but I also agree with Councilman McAteer that I don't want to rush an ordinance. If we're going to do this and we're going to put an ordinance in place, take our time and make sure the ordinance is right. I don't mind approving a letter of intent and pursuing this. I am in favor of it, but I don't want to rush the ordinance.
Councilman Gallagher.
This is a public safety issue. In 2009, we had 16 car accidents. In 2012, we had 48. I mean, we're doubling the rate of accidents. If we don't do anything, they're just gonna continue to expand. I mean, this is an option that we have right here on the table. Melissa, would it take much to put together, I understand you're busy and stuff, but would it take too much to craft a ordinance and present it to us on the March 18th meeting?
Well, I'd like to look at some of the sample ordinances. Chances are, we could draft something and bring it back to you, and certainly, as Chuck said, it would help if you could give us some direction on what types of things you'd like to see in it.
Well, some of the things that they've listed here are like 2 acres. Make sure that there's no hunting allowed in city parks. It's unlawful discharge a bow within 100 yards. And of course, you don't have to put in crossbows. You can say just bow and arrows. It's unlawful discharge a bow within 100 yards of a city park, school, daycare, church. But according to the map, it doesn't look like they're gonna be hunting downtown. I mean, according to this map, they're gonna be hunting on the outskirts of town, pretty much in areas that are undeveloped, that builders were going to go in there and chase the deer out. But now we're giving people opportunities, and the only way they can go on that land is if they have written permission. Now, the deer hunters, the bow hunters are more than responsible individuals. And when they hunt from tree stands, and they're not shooting across the room, they're actually shooting down towards the ground. So it's only like within 7 to 15 yards, their range. So I see that we can have an ordinance prepared for us on the March 18th timeframe, and if you want to put something out there in the public, it's not required, but that's up to council.
Well, let me ask a question while we're having this discussion. Is this council in favor of, like Huntersville, that models after North Carolina, or do you want a very strict one or a moderate one?
Strict.
Strict.
I mean, I think that gives the staff a little bit more direction, is you don't want this, okay? But do you want something in the middle, or do you want something that's a little bit more stricter than that's in the middle? And I hear more strict.
More strict.
Well, I think Mr. Gallagher really did a nice job of just, the shopping list of things
That's-
let's speak up if you're not in favor of those things, but no crossbows, 10-foot, high deer stand, all the things you just said, the staff recommendations, the 2 acres. I think we've got a lot of the parameters in place. I agree with Mr. Pearsall. I think the letter of intent is what we're hanging our hat on, and agree with Mr. McAteer that we don't have to rush the ordinance process. So that but if you feel strongly enough as a council that you're ready to make a commitment to, urban archery in this next season, that we place this letter of intent. See, Dr. Cobb wants to know that we're not going to back out on that. Okay, so if we're going to move forward, then we have time to draft an ordinance. We have time to solicit public input. Doesn't have to be a public hearing. We just, advertise it adequately. It's no different than what we just did with the drop boxes. We draft something, we, mull it over, we hash it, we get public input. We don't have to make a decision. We, if it takes 2 meetings, then we come back and we approve it at that point in time. But if that makes sense, then that's what I would recommend.
Councilman Kimball?
A couple of things. Number one, how onerous is this letter? And in fact, if we had some disagreements as far as an ordinance, or how binding is this letter? I've heard you've related a number of times, well, we got to have it in by the 1st. He wants it in by the 1st. What's your feeling on that?
As far as binding, I wouldn't say it's binding. I would
Okay.
say that if you probably talk to a majority of the wildlife commissioners, it would probably not be binding in that area. But I mean, you're going into a another working relationship with another, with a state agency, and you want to be we should always be in good standing with them regardless, but I think going into it in the right frame of mind and going into it with everything in place puts, where after we make that intent, we're talking to their biologists, we're talking to the game officials, the game wardens, looking at our parameters, looking at our maps with, Chief Conley, some of his folks, he may have to designate a couple of folks who may be the liaison between the wildlife officers, and that's going to take that takes some time too. I know they have some publications that go out, and I know I heard that July 1st was their drop dead date for their publications, but as far as the time and effort, their staff, I mean, really once you send that in, is to make a phone call to the biologist and set up a time for them to come out and look. And Kyle's done a lot of the research. Stacy's done a lot of the research, but they really want to look at that map and ride around and kind of get a feel for the area along with the game officials as well, is what I gathered from talking with Dr. Cobb. I mean, could we get out of it? We probably could. Well, I know we could, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it seemed like it was like you just really know what. I was trying to give him potential questions that may come up at this meeting, and 9 out of 10 of those have already come up for sure, or comments have come up, and this was one of them. And he said, well, just make sure you relate it. You really need to know for sure before you file this letter of intent. Just
Okay.
know for sure. Express to your elected officials to know for sure before you file.
Okay, thank you. Second part of my comment, it wasn't, I don't think Councilman Gallagher alluded to this, but I have a concern over what would be considered privately owned property where there's a city right-of-way. In particular, we have a lot of areas, Dave, over in your area, some other areas, where you have the pipelines going through, the power lines. Sometimes there's a perception that that's public land, when in fact it's privately owned by the property owners, but specifically, for the most part, the city or the other entity operating that, they're the only ones really with the right-of-way. And that was one of the concerns that was raised to me, is it kind of looks like it's park and woods, but in fact, it's really somebody's backyard. And, but it looks, kind of like it's mowed, and I know deer go there. And so that's something that I would like to make sure that we looked at very carefully when we draft this.
I think Councilman makes a very good point. It's the thing that we're most concerned about, because what happens is, just as Councilman mentioned, we have it with four-wheelers and others, and they think that because it's a utility right-of-way, that it's public land and they can do anything they want. They cannot. It's usually private property owners that go back into where we have our sewer lines, and in fact, that is where the deer go, down in there. And so it's also where the children go. So there is some concern about all that, and all that needs to be dealt with, and we need to be careful about it.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Dr. Pearl.
What about this thought? What if, and I know this puts Melissa and Ash a little bit on the spot, but as you were saying, what about trying to draft something ordinance-wise? It's a draft, but come up with something in the next 2 weeks. Hold off on this letter of intent. Don't commit to that tonight. Since let's look at a draft, give us a couple weeks to mull over this. In the meanwhile, maybe we'll get some public comment in the next 2 weeks. We'll have a draft to look at in the next 2 weeks. We can always decide, even if the draft is not accepted and we want to make more modifications, but we've had more time to think about it, and then in 2 weeks we can make a decision as to whether or not to file the letter of intent. So then we've got 2 weeks to think about it. We've got a draft to look at. Maybe the draft is such that we still have, several questions out there that we can't all get our arms around, to feel comfortable about that letter. And then we back off and we wait a year. But if we feel pretty good that the substance of the draft ordinance is the direction we want to go, then we make that letter of intent, and then we clean up the draft, in the ensuing weeks.
There's a motion and a second on the floor,
There's a motion and a second, and then also
an
a
amendment.
motion to amend,
To
and
amend.
that's what I wanted to
Right, okay.
retouch on. My motion was to approve the committee's recommendation, which would be a letter of intent, and then staff would work on an ordinance. The amendment was to have that ordinance back by the next council
18th.
meeting. I don't mind that amendment, I will accept that amendment to the motion. However, I don't want the stipulation that that ordinance has to be passed by the next meeting. I think it's fine, like Dr. Curlin said, if you have a draft kind of ordinance for us to look at, we've already said we intend to do it, we're gonna follow through, we're starting on our ordinance, you guys give us a draft ordinance, we have another discussion, public comes, maybe someone from the public brings up something none of us have even thought about, and we wanna add it to the ordinance. So, the ordinance can be ongoing, but go ahead and say, we intend to do the letter. So,
Couldn't you?
There was a
What,
second
Dr.
to that.
Second.
No, wasn't there already a
Yeah.
second?
Walt seconded
Yes,
the
Walt
motion.
seconded. Are you,
Are you gonna
are
second
you
the
gonna
amendment?
second the amendment? Okay, so there's a motion plus the
And there is a
amendment.
second
And
to the
there's-
motion, and I'm also going to second the amendment.
Okay, that's what I needed to find out. Okay. Any discussion to the amendment? Yes?
I just think that Dr. Curlin had a great idea, to bring the ordinance back, discuss it, and not send the letter of intent right now. Wait 2 weeks.
We have till the 1st.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
I wish you'd withdraw your motion and wait for the letter of intent, once they
Well,
bring the ordinance.
we can make the letter of intent
Yeah.
next week. I didn't put a deadline on the letter of intent. I just said we're voting in favor to pursue the letter of intent.
Okay,
That's
okay.
the-
So
that's-
we're-
No
okay,
deadline on
so
the
we
letter.
don't have to, okay, semantics, I'm sorry.
Okay.
was
So
no- there
as
was
long
no
as we
date
do not
indicated.
file the letter
no, we-
before
yeah, well, I'm
the next
fine.
meeting,
So you're not directing staff to file a letter of intent, you're directing us to pursue the ordinance and come back with more information next meeting.
Now, that's my understanding.
That is mine
Okay,
as well.
Is that
We-
what the understanding of the council is that, that's the motion that's on the floor?
The motion on the floor is to accept the committee recommendation that we pursue the letter of intent.
Okay,
Now, if we
pursue,
do it
not
tonight
file.
or we do it next week is
Okay.
fine.
okay, all right.
And that we also, the amendment is to, at the next meeting, have a draft ordinance that we review, discuss, and accept public comment on. Not necessarily a declared public hearing, but during the public discussion, we would amend the rules to allow discussion with the public. Something similar to that. Does that is that good for the motion? Do we have that?
All right,
Make sure we're all.
okay. Everybody understands the motion? All in favor of the motion, raise your right hand. All opposed? Motion passes.
And is that what you guys need to pursue to continue?
Absolutely, absolutely. There just one other thing that popped up is, there's no hunting allowed on Sundays with guns, and muzzle loader guns, but there is Sunday hunting allowed with bow and arrow. That question did come up, whether or not, and some cities have decided they did not allow
Did.
that in their ordinance. Some did not. Didn't know how you want it. Wouldn't be whether Melissa and I cared one way or could draft that one way or the other. That would be something for
I'm for taking down the herd.
I think,
we can have we'll just have a number of
Sunday's fine.
things in there, and then that next meeting, then you can pick
That's-
a la carte to
Yes,
add or
we'll put
take
everything in
out.
there and then,
There we
It's
go.
easier
That
to
sounds good.
delete than to put back in at a later time, okay? Thank you. But that's
we're
not all
only
of
on
your
number
report.
one on your report, aren't we?
No, well, I told you we were gonna focus
We're not
on
done?
this, we're gonna,
No, sir.
fast forward through the others,
Okay.
okay? We're
Item
gonna
number
fast
2.
forward, but one final comment, do you think, if Steve Duncan has the young guns, Kyle McNamara will have the young bows? I don't
Could-
know, we'll see.
Could be.
We'll
Could
see,
be.
we'll see, but anyway.
How many dollars do you have? 3? 4, and they all hunt. His 4 daughters all hunt with
Right,
bow and arrow.
right. So, okay, well, we're going to fast forward here, okay? So the second was the master plan review, and this was focused on Sims Park and the skeet range, okay? So after a discussion with the commission, it was brought to light to the commission that both Sims Park has some issues. If we stay there, we're going to need to upgrade the facility, and yet we're also talking about the possibility of relocating, you know, a facility to a different location. So there wasn't a whole lot, you know, discussed with that. But the skeet range, and a similar discussion occurred, just the fact that if the skeet range is going to remain in its current location, it's also going to need to be upgraded, but there are discussions forthcoming with relocating the skeet range. So, and that there was a proposal that was going to be put in this year's budget to replace some of the, what do you call them, Chuck? Throw the clay,
Trap and
yeah,
skeet.
trap machines, yeah, okay. So, that was item 2. Number 3 was the use of electronic cigarettes, e-cigarettes. So this is getting kind of interesting, because now these e-cigarettes are coming around. Well, nobody really knows what to do with e-cigarettes. So whether we should be outlawing them or not, and so various portions of staff are looking at this, whether it be legal, human resources, Parks and Rec, you know. So this is a kind of a new topic. Fortunately, we're not talking about pot. So,
It's not Colorado.
no, it's not Colorado nor the state of Washington, so. Sir?
Do e-cigarettes smell?
They have flavor.
They
No, do
they can have
do
an
they smell?
aroma, actually, a pleasant
They
smell,
can
I
or
think.
cannot. It's
Yeah,
a vapor.
it's water, it's a
You can get
vapor.
With smell or without.
Yeah, so, but we're not gonna get into this, we're gonna fast forward.
Just asked.
Okay, that's okay. So, why don't you Google that? Okay, item 4, okay, which was other discussion. Well, you know, this thing came up through Central City about, you know, possibly relieving the city or relieving the builders of the park and rec fees, which is a pay-in-lieu fee that was created several years ago. And so this was brought forward to the RIC, you know, because this would obviously impact, you know, future funding of recreation facilities. And so staff did report that there had been $53,000 or $54,000 collected in District C and D for this, and that, for instance, the District D funds were earmarked to go to the city's match for Ashbrook Tennis Court. So the District C funds will be used at either Sims, Bradley, or additional Greenway parking. So you can see the positive effect of those fees. And so the RAC went on record to state that they would like to see us keep those fees intact and not change that ordinance, and that was a vote that they took, which was unanimous. So RAC is going on record to council as saying, please do not take those park and rec fees, because they're not that much, and they help us in a big way. And there's not going to be those kinds of funds in another source in the future. So I know that's moving forward through another committee process, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. So, and that's the end of my report. Any questions?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I have one question.
Councilman Pearsall
For
does
your-
have a question.
Your number 4, that was also going to, I think, the planning commission. So are you going to recommend that? I mean, are you going to send a copy of that to the planning commission as well? 'Cause we'll actually vote on it before we'll get it.
Yeah, they will. And I'll just ask Mr. Dellinger to make sure that the planning commission is made aware of that. Okay?
I just think it would be good information for them to have.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
voting.
Do you know when they're taking that up?
I don't know.
I don't know.
This idea about how to process it, which committee to send it to, I think when the Housing and Central City Committee discussed utilities issue, it seemed pretty straightforward that the Utilities Committee should have it. Exactly where it should go for the rec fees, it ultimately, one of the ways that it's imposed, it's in the UDO.
UDO.
And so the planning commission has to first recommend a change to the UDO. Should be on. No, it's not. I'm sorry. Okay, you want me to start over?
No, you
Okay, all right. So it has to, they have to recommend a change, so you could go through it. Now, I did talk to Jason Thompson, and he said, you know, the Planning Commission was not really engaged or involved in that before. They, you know, it just went through them, but it actually was created internally here at basically at City Hall for the staff. So it can be the Planning Commission, or it can be one of the other committees. Ultimately, we'll have to go to the Planning Commission because it resides within the UDO.
Right,
right.
yeah.
Well, I think it already came through housing. It's already been through the Parks and Rec Commission, so.
But the planning commission doesn't normally set fees. That's why I think Jason was a little, normally, they set policy for land use, but for fee issues, that would normally, they would get direction from council
Yeah.
before it would come.
There are a few parts of the UDO that actually stipulate fees.
But
It's a minor piece of the whole ordinance.
And the committee can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the issue was the amount, it was just that there is that fee. Get rid of the fee. So I don't think the planning commission would even have to decide on an amount, just, is it gonna
Do they recommend?
Do they recommend
having it?
having it or
Right.
recommend getting rid of it? It's either gonna stay the same or go away, one of the two. And we've heard one view, and the planning commission will give a second, and then it'll come to us.
Because it'll eventually come back to the city council
Yes,
anyway,
council's-
regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a
Right.
council decision,
Right.
a policy decision of city council. I think the only question is, where do you want any preliminary discussions
Right.
held? Where do you think the proper venue for this thing is?
Planning commission.
Well, your committee's also already recommended to the planning commission, and unless this body would say no, then I guess it'll go to the planning commission. Of course, the planning commission may not want to comment on it either. They may say, we're not going to take that up. We don't set fees.
It could be.
The-
We'll wait and see what they say, I guess.
So for now, it's going to the planning commission, and Chuck will make sure they get a copy.
Item number 8, city attorney's report.
I have nothing to report.
Item number 9, city manager's report.
Just a few items. First, if you notice that there was a lot of publicity in the Charlotte Observer about ash ponds right next to our water source at Mountain Island Lake. And I did get an email just actually early this morning from Duke Energy. They are going to have their person that's in charge of the hydro licensing work with our staff to give us all the information about what's going on. Tim Goss is our representative, the governmental affairs representative. We've expressed, concern, of course, because that is our water source. And we would like to know and get information about what Duke is intending to do about moving those ash ponds. Now, along with that, I want to remind the City Council that in Gastonia's situation, we do have an alternative way to go to South Fork should a disaster happen. But that's the water source for the City of Charlotte, its primary water source, as well as our primary water source. So you don't want to really even think about it, but we've already had that one problem in the Dan River and the one in Tennessee, and I think there are 5 others that there's some question about. So we, just a month ago, actually did take some water from South Fork. We still have that pump operating there. That's what we would use. We have Rankin Lake as a 5 to 7 day reserve, but that's not a permanent play. But the permanent move, should any disaster befall us, would be to go, or a long-term, I should say, rather than permanent, would be to go back to the South Fork where we still have our intake. So this is a very important issue. We're working with the state and with Duke and with with Barry Gullett, with CMUD across the lake. This is the water source that Duke Energy's headquarters office uses. We would certainly think that this really wouldn't happen, but you must always still be engaged and prepared. And so wanted to assure the city council that we are engaged with everybody there and watching this situation.
May I make a comment?
Yes, sir.
I know it's very serious. I've been reading the Shaw Observer all about how Diener is, the supervisors have told the regulators that work for Diener, that we're gonna try to work something out with Duke, and they, for years, have tried to crack down on Duke Power. I don't trust Duke Power on this. I think they're cheap. I think they want to save the money. They want to spend the money. I wish this council would think about this and consider going on record asking Duke to drain their ash ponds and take their all the residue and put it in a lined landfill, like a lot of people are recommending, and do that with all of them, and do it immediately. And if it costs them all the profits this year, that's fine. They created that, and not to charge the ratepayers, but to take out, they're guaranteed profit of the state, and like 10% or something, 8 or 10%, which is a lot. But I think we ought to consider taking a firm stand that they clean up these ash ponds, because eventually we're gonna have a problem with Mountain Island Lake, if not sooner probably than later. It really worries me too. We need to take a stand and encourage all other cities to take a stand also and put pressure on Duke Power to clean these places up now, right now, not a year from now, 2 years from now, but right now. Start planning for that.
Councilman Gallagher.
Ed, taking water from the South Fork, were there any problems?
I don't know if we had any. Flip, do you?
Oh, I guess because I'm not beside you, I didn't notice it was, no.
Councilman, not necessarily problems. The biggest reason we went to Mountain Island Lake was quantity and quality.
Well, I mean,
I
do we
meant
have any problems when
South
we
Fork.
operated the pumps at South Fork
No, not that we're aware of, no.
the last, yeah?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I thought, misunderstood the question.
So we keep them primed, I guess?
Well, actually,
maintained?
we hadn't for a while, and I think it's recently, we've been kind of working to make sure we get that back again. And it's a backup situation. That's really what that is. That's not, but it, from my understanding is we got everything working there. We would use that time that we had at Rankin to help us. And there's some other things that we can do too. I mean, but we're watching this, we're practicing a little bit at South Fork. But
First backup is certainly Rankin Lake for short-term outage, and we've used that regularly over the past years, either just to test it or in cases where we needed to shut down and work on the raw water line. So the secondary backup at the South Fork is not used as regularly, but this latest test, we can utilize it for a longer-term event.
Flip.
Anything else?
Yeah, yes, another item in the newspaper, again, the Observer, yeah, it's funny, over the weekend, about Whitewater, about the Mecklenburg County maybe not giving them the last payment, which is like $1 million, because remember, Whitewater is actually on property owned by Mecklenburg County Parks Land. Our payment was $71,429, and we've already sent that to Whitewater. This is our last year payment, so we're done. There was a question that Mecklenburg County is having about the accounting, their records. We get an audit or a financial statement from them. We didn't see any irregularities ourselves, but we've contacted Mecklenburg County to try to get some clarification, because of course if there's something askew, we may not have to provide all that money, but we've already sent it, so whether we would try to get it back. But ours is $71,429. Theirs is $1 million. Theirs, it's a little different in scale, but we are checking into that. The next.
Pardon me, Ed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But on that account, we haven't heard anything from Mr. Weiss in years, because when he needed us, he showed up. Now he doesn't need us, and he doesn't come around. And he hasn't told us how his facility's doing in the last several years. And there were some, I won't say promises, but there were some assurances made or some suggestions made back in the day that, you know, the entities that helped get this, you know, facility going would reap some benefit at some later point in time. So I'm just wondering if we shouldn't invite Mr. Weiss to come to us at some point, and we can ask him some questions and
Bring tickets.
bring his financial information with him and some idea of his future projections, and ask him to show us the money,
Okay.
you know? So, because that's what they said, you know? Even it was, you come back to our own Parks and Rec departments, you know, for helping to enhance our facilities going forward, once they became profitable. So I'd be curious to hear from
Okay, we'll,
him or them.
if council wishes, we'll contact Mr. Wise.
Is that
invite him
okay?
to-
I think that would be a recommendation that this
Yeah.
council would certainly support, is to getting Mr. Wise at the earliest convenience to come to our council meeting and give us a update of the financial
Oh, yeah.
records.
Mhm.
Yeah, it won't be the next meeting because we have a pretty
As
full.
soon as
Yeah, right,
possible.
yes, okay. Okay. Next, we will be doing budget meetings with departments starting this week and next. And then finally, I had a meeting with some of the league representatives. There are some issues that are coming up this next session. Privilege licenses, the state's talking about doing it a different way. Gastonia only gets less than $300,000 from privilege licenses. Some cities like Hickory get millions of dollars because they do it on gross receipts. Gastonia does not, so we are not as impacted. The state's talking about simplifying that system and maybe not allowing for gross receipts. So there's a big impact on some cities, not so much on others. It's possible maybe they could do away with it altogether, but there's this whole long discussion about hold harmless for cities and things like that. Another one deals with a more serious one for us, is one dealing with restricting what transfers of utilities and utility reporting. And it's submitted by the same person that did the Asheville legislation to take the water and sewer system from the city of Asheville. And the concern is that there may be, this is the beginning of taking more utility systems from cities. So this is an important issue. And then there's another issue about taking away the city's rights to have design standards in trade for density. And one of the things that really works well when you do it well is that you allow developers to have increased density, but you ask for better, higher design in trade. And so you would want to have that as an option for your city, but they're talking about possibly taking that away. So there may be some others come up. This is their short session. So there won't be as much legislation. They usually limit it, but they make their own rules, and things can happen late in the session. And so we'll need to develop a conversation, informal, perhaps, or formal, but informal actually seems to work better, that with our legislative delegation about these and other issues that we may have.
Have we put together a legislative agenda
We have the legislative agenda that we had from last year.
from last year, but we haven't put one together for this year?
No,
Would that be in order to do?
I think it would.
And when do you think that we could have that put together?
Yes. I think we could put that together in,
Since this
by
is
the,
a
ne-
short
by the,
session.
by the, actually by the next, probably by the next council meeting.
Okay, by March 18th?
Mhm.
Okay. If we could have that, I think that would be advantageous for all of us to have a copy of a draft of a legislative agenda.
And that,
The legislative
May.
session is May, right?
May, starts in May.
So if we
But-
have it by the next.
Yeah.
Right.
but one of the things they're doing is they're having these interim study committees that are going on now.
Right.
And so you want to kind of watch where that goes. But yeah, you're really not going to be doing anything until May. But that's all the report that I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
City council reports, Councilman Kimball.
Yes, along with Dr. Curlin and his wife, and Councilman Gallagher and his wife, we were able to attend the 100th anniversary of the Gaston County Chamber. Pretty exciting, especially really like the presentation on 100 years in the future, and what it's maybe going to look like in Gastonia and Gaston County. Very good program. I want to congratulate Mr. Bob Clay, opened a new office right down the road, and we work with him a lot. We were working with him on the Firestone Mill, and I think it's great that he's got a place closer to home. I participated in the ribbon cutting for Gastonia Chrysler, Jeep, Dodge, and Ram trucks, and wanted to congratulate Robin and Jack Salzman. They're the new owners there, and they do have some exciting plans for the dealership. They're going to be doing some expansions to make it a little bit more user-friendly for the customer, and certainly put a new face out there for that dealership. And lastly, attended last night the Cancer Services Faces of Hope Steering Committee meeting, and as far as the contributions, and again, I hope everybody puts April 4th on their calendar for the Faces of Hope dinner, evening, and silent auction. Getting to feel a really great vibe, and I think it's going to be an exciting event. That's all I have, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Curlin.
Just one short request, if council is still interested, I think we were originally intending to try and make a contribution for the first phase of the Optimus Park, and if we want to go forward with the second phase, if I could get checks from each of you for $70, then we'd have essentially a $500 brick in our name placed in that part of the park. And if you could bring that in the next 2 weeks, that would be great, and we could just make that happen. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Councilman Gallagher.
Just one item. I too was at the Gaston Conference Center for the Chamber of Commerce. One thing that I noticed, and I brought up to Councilman Kimball and maybe Councilman Curlin as well, is when we have speakers at the conference center, there's no spotlight on them. It's almost like they're in a dark place. I mean, there's no overhead lighting for the speaker to be, so I would like us to look into that, just to enhance, you know, because I was sitting all the way in the back. But anyway, it was just something, food for thought, to make the conference center a little bit nicer. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Pearsall.
No report.
Councilman
No
McAdoo.
report.
May I make one comment, though? Mayor
Pardon me?
Pro Tem, may I make one comment?
Yes, yes.
When staff is working on the ordinance, going back to the urban hunting, I noticed the one person or department we didn't talk to that's gonna be most responsible for this is the police department and the chief. So if we could,
I think he hung.
make sure they get input on that, please,
And also,
because they're gonna have to enforce it if somebody
Yes.
breaks these rules.
and
So-
currently, there is an ordinance that where the police chief or his designee, and I think his designee is Rob, and issue permits now. And this is for various kinds of animals, and one of them is referred to as a varmint. And, let's see, I'm not sure, what's a varmint?
A barman,
The 6-point buck that's by my house.
a coon, a possum,
And
a rat.
so there are certain numbers of these that are currently done, and then there's another section of that same ordinance that talks about hunting, and it's on larger acreage. Now, this is where you're talking about with guns, and there's a regulation on the type of shot that's used and the type of weapon that's used, and they are here. They have that information if you want to hear it, but you know, they're going to be very important in this whole making the ordinance effective.
Well, I was gonna say, we had all this conversation, not once did anyone mention the police, and I'm like, please include them on discussions as you draft that, so that was all.
Just some brief announcements. I think we all have a copy of it, but remember March 7th, 12:15 Arbor Day, weather permitting, Limburger Park. March 12th, we've already talked about the Center City Revitalization and Housing, 3:30 here at City Hall. March 26th is our first budget work session at 5:30 here at City Hall. supper will be included in that, right?
Yes.
Okay. March 27th is the bowling tournament at Liberty Lanes. I keep Gastonia Beautiful, Highway 321 South. Put those on your calendar. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to hear about it.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Motion?
In a lot of backyards. My backyard in Sioux City, everybody, yeah, those, and that's where